Okay, hopefully I'm doing everything that I need to do. Here's what I'd like you to write down, some of these things. You guys can see that at home, right?
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. So, Prussia is the state that I'll show you. It is centered around, eventually it's centered around Berlin. And Prussia is a relatively poor, kind of a backwater part of the Holy Roman Empire. However, it is important because one of its ruler is an elector of Brandenburg. He is a guy who helps elect the Holy Roman Emperor when that is important. It's increasingly not very important, bless you, after 1648, after the end of the 30 Years' War. I'm going to tell you that Prussian absolutism is relatively successful based upon their military. This is a fun thesis for the entire year. It's like my thesis about Russia being kind of backward all the time. Prussia is a military state. In fact, there's this not very funny joke about how Prussia, unlike any other other places are states with militaries, Prussia is a military with a state. And so thinking about that, everything that Prussia becomes or everything that Prussia is seems to be attached to the importance of their military. Number one, for example, when they're trying to control their nobles, they do this in a very interesting way. They create for the nobility the ability for them to serve in the military. In fact, being an officer in the military is attached to, or you can't be an officer without being a so-called Junker. A Junker is a Prussian noble. That goes on for a really long period of time. In fact, if you get all the way up into, sorry for the spoiler here, but in World War II, Prussia has basically taken over Germany or created a modern Germany in the 19th century. And you figure that in World War II and in World War I, the Germans have a very militaristic state, and you still have these Prussian officers, or these Junker officers who are running the military in large measure in World War I and World War II. So these nobles, way back when in the 17th century, the 1600s, are gladly serving their ruler instead of making trouble for him, instead of challenging him in little parliaments and things like that. They're getting all of their fun, they're getting all of their prestige from serving the military. Now, the kings of Prussia, the rulers of Prussia, have to give something back to them. They're getting this wonderful service in the military. The thing they give back is absolute power on their estates. So these nobles have serfs. They have a bunch of unfree labor who work for them. And the crown says, do what you want with your serfs. That's our gift to you, and your gift to us is serving the military. That deal works out really quite nicely for both sides. Who does it not work out great for? Serfs. For the serfs, right. The serfs also serve in the military, but they're more like cannon fodder. They're the people who get mowed down in all these battles. Number two, it's really hard in Eastern Europe in general. Eastern Europe is always economically behind Western Europe. Not if that makes sense to you. Even today. Okay, so it's kind of hard to get a lot of revenue from an economy that just doesn't produce very much. So the Hohenzollern family, that's the royal family of Prussia, tries to just keep spending under control, and they try to use their own serfs and their own lands to more or less create revenue for their state, their own personal lands. The other thing that they do is when they get involved in a war, they more or less shop themselves out to the highest bidder. They go to the two different sides in the War of Spanish Succession, for example, and say, well, who's willing to fund us getting involved in this war? And one side or the other offers more, and so they're very kind of a mercenary sort of state in that way. The bourgeoisie, to the extent that they exist, because usually bourgeois people are, where are bourgeois people from originally? They're middle class. So where do we find these middle class people? Perfect, towns. Towns and trade. Good. So usually the bourgeoisie, the middle class, are tradespeople, artisans, guild people, and so on. Not so much in Eastern Europe. The economy is much weaker. Towns are much weaker. And in Prussia, you've got some middle-class people who are more or less bureaucrats. They are mostly serving the government, especially when they're trying to run number 3, law and administration. these bourgeois people, these middle-class people in other states eventually will challenge the nobility for power, will challenge the crown for power. These bourgeois people, these middle-class people in Prussia are kind of like wannabe soldiers or desk soldiers. You know, they want to be like the Prussian Junkers or the nobles in serving the king, but they're not serving on the battlefield. So they try to be really efficient behind their desks. So they try to be really efficient and soldier-like in their bureaucracy. For control of religion, it just doesn't matter that much to the Hohenzollern family. Most of their people are Lutheran. Eventually they're going to take over some Catholic people. They themselves are Calvinists. It doesn't matter to them. When the Huguenots are kicked out of France, they welcome 20,000 Huguenots to Berlin, and those Huguenots enrich Berlin and enrich Brandenburg, Prussia. It's a gain for them. They just don't care that much about religion or what religion their subjects are. Once again, trying to force your people to be some religion has very diminishing gains. There's really no good thing there. Really, there never was, but it took them a long time to figure that out. Here's the thing with Brandenburg, Prussia as well, is that it is 3 different areas initially. And their sort of reason for being has to do with taking over more land in order to unify those places and then take over more land just to make it bigger and more powerful. They use the military to kind of create a unified culture. So at one point in time, you've got this area in the far western part of what becomes Germany. This is a very different part from this part right here. And then this part over here in the east, and then finally this part way over here in the east. These 3 or 4 different areas start to come together. They're grabbing land here where it says Brandenburg. Eventually they're grabbing this sort of yellowish land, and sort of at the end of our Unit 3 story, they're going to grab this place called Silesia. And from this, they are unifying their state. They're doing number 5. They're getting millions more people added to their fairly underpopulated lands and becoming a power that can contend with the Habsburgs, the Austrian power. So once again, the military is binding these 3 or 4 or 5 different regions together and creating a unified Prussia. Really, how else could they do that if they aren't together? If they have territories between their territories, it's kind of hard to have one credible state. So that is number 5, gaining territory. Finally, number 6 is this thing about the new military. Look at going back to 1640, when well, you know what's going on in 1640, or why between 1640 and 1648 they would move from like 2,000 soldiers to 30 years old. So 30 years war is going on. In fact, there is a document in our DBQ where Gustavus Adolphus is telling the Elector of Brandenburg, you got to get on our side or else. And so look at how the military increases from 2,000 soldiers to 30,000 soldiers at the end of Frederick William the Great Elector's rule. His son, Frederick I, increases it to 40,000 soldiers. His son, Frederick William I, increases it to 86,000 soldiers. It's an explosion of the number of soldiers, and once again, it's uniting these territories culturally, politically, and creating the 4th largest army in Europe at that point in time with the 13th largest population. The size of their population, the size of the military is completely mismatched. But it's the thing that creates their state, so that's why they do it. Do you have any questions for me about that? We're good? Did I prove to you that they are semi-successful as an absolute state based on their military? Okay, good. Nodding heads, I like that. All right, let's move on then to the Habsburgs of Austria. I'm going to tell you that the Habsburgs of Austria are less successful than the Prussians, and we'll see if we can come up with a way that they are. somewhat successful nonetheless. Habsburg absolutism. It's somewhat difficult to talk about this place until it gets a name that we can call it. It sort of used to be the Holy Roman Empire, but once again, that doesn't matter so much anymore. The family that controls these different territories is the Habsburg family. They're probably my favorite family in Europe. The Habsburgs are unable to create a fairly credible absolute monarchy at this point in time because, here's my thesis, because they have such a disparate empire. They have so many different territories in different places. You saw that the Prussians were able to concentrate together their territories. These guys have wonderful territories that are not geographically connected all the time, and certainly in every other way are unconnected in language and culture and so on. What binds them together is only that they have the same family ruling over them. I'm sure somebody knows this. The Habsburg family themselves, if you had to come up with their ethnicity, since they have this multi-ethnic empire. And what is an Austrian really? Don't tell them this because you're really mad. Yeah. They're German people. They're German people in Vienna, basically, these Habsburg people. And so you look at number one, trying to control the nobility, and maybe we should just look really quickly at the map as you guys hear us write some things down. So this map, I don't know if it's particularly effective for us, but you can see that this greenish area, greenish areas are all of the different lands of Habsburg Empire. So we've got here's Austria right here in the middle, and Vienna's in there somewhere, and then Bohemia. You might remember the Bohemian phase of the 30 Years' War and the whole story of the 30 Years' War. That was all about for them trying to make the Holy Roman Empire a new monarchy, Germany, and as you know, that failed. And so we've got Hungary over here. Bohemia is in the middle. Down here or up here is a part of northern Italy. This is Lombardy with Milan. And this bit down here is basically Naples, and maybe Sicily gets involved there too. Over here, this is not part of the Dutch Republic. It's part of what they start to call it used to be the Spanish Netherlands, and now they're starting to call it the Austrian Netherlands. And Bobby and I know that it's actually called Belgium. Yeah. So you've got these different areas that are trying to be bound together by this one German family in Vienna. So number one, really, it's the same thesis that I'm going to hit over and over. All of these different places, these disparate regions, make it really difficult for them to enact any kind of centralizing thing, like Louis XIV does, or like Peter the Great does, or even like the Hohenzollern with their military does. Way back when, under Charles V, the Habsburgs had a united empire of the Holy Roman Empire and Spain, and it was wonderfully powerful. It just doesn't work out. It gets split up, and now Spain is sort of on the decline. We won't talk much about Spain anymore, so after the Spanish. We will talk a lot about these Austrian Habsburgs, and wonder, I think, when is this going to fall apart? It's so many different places. When is it going to unravel? Well, it's not going to unravel for a really long period of time. We're going to be impressed by how long they continue to exist in an age of nationalism. So you've got Austrian nobles and Bohemian nobles and Hungarian nobles and Italian nobles in quotes and Belgian nobles in quotes. How do you control all of those different kinds of nobles? Each and every one of those places has different kinds of parliaments or assemblies or diets. You have to, as a Habsburg ruler, try to control each and every one of these different places in a different way. It's not easy. In addition to that, you still have that same kind of Eastern European lagging economy. There's no Atlantic trade going on. There's no voyages of exploration or anything like that that's bringing products to Eastern Europe in the same way that you have with France or Spain or England. In addition to that, in Eastern Europe, you have serfs. I think I did not mention that or didn't emphasize it enough with Russia. Serfs are unfree labor. They're like peasants who don't work for money. And so this is less successful. Therefore, it's going to be they're going to be less able to get revenue because of that. In addition, they don't have that same sort of small soldierly bureaucracy. They don't have the efficient Prussian bureaucrats. They have a bunch of local nobles and some middle-class people who they're relying on in all these different places to try to effect some sort of control. It just doesn't work well. If you have to rely on nobles to help you run your state, you're kind of in trouble because the nobles generally have their own things that they want to do. Sometimes they listen well, and sometimes they don't listen very well. And in this big Habsburg Empire with all these different kinds of nobles in all these different places, it just doesn't work very well. The Habsburgs, like their Spanish cousins before they died out with Charles II, really do want to continue with Catholicism. They think that Catholicism is the one true religion, but they're not able always to get everyone to be Catholic, and they don't really care too much about it, usually. There might be, I'll tell you about a ruler towards the end of this unit. A ruler comes along and she says, hey, I really don't like Protestants, and she finds some and she sends them away.
Doesn't she send them to Transylvania?
She sends them to Transylvania, where, as you know, they become werewolves and vampires. So it's just a terrible thing. They do gain territory. The Habsburgs are oddly able, going all the way back to the 1400s, they're oddly able to keep collecting territory in spite of the fact that they seem to be semi-competent, or that they don't really have a very effective military. They win wars with help of others, and they sort of beat up on people who are fairly easy to beat up upon, and they grab territory. So you read on Friday, hopefully, about the Ottoman Empire a little bit. The Ottoman Empire is probably a greater disaster, as we'll see in this class, than all the other European states in terms of holding on to territory. And so the story of the Austrian Empire from 1683 down into World War I is a movement from this bit here that says, you can barely see it, Kingdom of Hungary, moving down into the part that says Ottoman, Ottoman dominions. So they keep pushing into the 1700s and so on, all the way down, pushing the Ottoman Empire that keeps crumbling, keeps falling apart, once again, for a really long period of time. It's like a slug match between these two different nations that are sort of slowly dying and they don't know it. So gaining territory at the Ottomans' expense is something that they're doing. Finally, with this new military, they do it just like everybody else does. They try to recruit more troops and have uniforms and uniform weapons and the whole thing that Louis XIV and everyone else is doing. I think, though, it's difficult to have soldiers who are from all these different places. It becomes increasingly difficult as time goes by. At this point in time, maybe it doesn't matter that much. People who are on the battlefield are just kind of like there because they have to be there, and they're just following orders of a nobleman who's standing behind them with a stick. Later, though, or maybe even partially now, how do you get excited about fighting for this polyglot empire? You know, people start to feel nationalism. They want to fight for England, or Spain, or France, or even Prussia, whatever the heck that is. What do you say when you're on the battlefield as a Habsburg soldier? I'm fighting for the Habsburgs. It just doesn't really, some German family from Vienna, and you are an Italian person. It may not matter now, but every year that goes by, as nationalism increases, you want to fight for people like yourself. It's just really hard. So I think the different troops are harder to control. I think not having nationalism also makes it maybe less. Did I convince you that they're not particularly successful as pulling something together from absolutism? And what was my chief argument? Why are they not particularly successful?
Too ethnically diverse.
I'll take that. Too ethnically diverse. Too many places. Good. I feel good about that. Now, I want to tell you about the most disastrous state. I have a lot of sympathy for it, but it's a disaster nonetheless. It's a disaster in terms of getting absolutism done. I'm going to play around with the lights a little bit. Usually I have is that okay? Does it feel like a nightclub now? For really old people? All right. So usually I do pinks and reds when we're talking about communism or socialism, Karl Marx and so on, but for some reason I can't remember why I chose red for Poland, Lithuania.
Because Poland is red and white, right?
Yes, it is. It's got a red and white flag. Maybe that was it. So at one point in time, you have this wonderful empire called Poland-Lithuania, the Grand Duchy of Poland-Lithuania. But what it turns into is the opposite of what most of these states aspire to. Most of these states are aspiring to absolutism, rule by one ruler. This is not getting there, and I'll explain how aristocratic liberty leads to chaos, which leads to, I guess it would be -5. The loss of territory rather than the gain of territory. It is in some ways like the Habsburg Empire in terms of it's got a lot of different kinds of people in it. It has Polish people, of course. You kind of expect that it's Poland. But within Poland, and within this larger sort of Poland on steroids, if we want to think about it from a modern sense, there are a lot of Germans who live in Poland. Ethnic Germans start moving into this region in the Middle Ages and kind of continue to do that for a long period of time. The farther you go through Poland and into the east towards Russia, you're going to run into Ukrainians or Little Russians. There's quite a number of Little Russians. They're a little bit different than regular Russians. Speak a little bit differently, have slightly different history and culture. There are also Lithuanian people on the Baltic. As I said, it's Poland and Lithuania at this period of time. There aren't too many Lithuanians in comparison to the number of Poles, but there are enough there to make it a fairly credible state. Within the towns and within a bunch of little villages throughout Poland, there's also people who migrated to Poland in the Middle Ages. They're Jewish people, invited to come there by the kings of Poland because they wanted to populate their territories, and because they could use Jewish people sometimes to collect taxes from the rest of their subjects. They could, over time, also borrow money from Jewish people if they were wealthy enough to have that kind of money. So it's kind of a polyglot place, where it's a lot of different people with different cultures and different languages. It's kind of a big flat place as well. There isn't really a lot of mountains or impassable rivers or anything like that that would keep it from being protected. So it is, if you can see from this big splotch here on the map, it really is much larger than today's Poland. Today's Poland kind of moves around recently anyway. Big state, a lot of population, could be very powerful. If you're playing Civilization 5 or whatever the number is today, you're being Poland, Lithuania. Is that a thing? Can you do that in Civ 5?
Just Poland.
Just Poland, okay. Well, you could create a credible state, I think, if you could do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? The things that make a new monarchy or the royal state. Here's Poland getting put together, I guess. Different crowns, the crown of Poland and the crown of Lithuania. That happens because of a royal marriage at one point in time. Anyway, starting to get things put together. In terms of religion, might as well talk about religion. Controlling religion is number 4, but this isn't something that the monarchs are doing. Here's what's going on with religion in Poland. And religion in Poland is very important all the way down to what's today? October 2020. It's pretty important in Poland. Being Catholic is pretty important in Poland. There is, during the Reformation, there is a period of time early on when Polish nobles are moving towards Calvinism, moving towards Lutheranism. The Jesuits are formed, and the Jesuits go into Poland and preach their way and educate their way into making Poland a very Catholic place, especially for the ethnic Poles.
So wait, everything's like backwards here.
Kind of, yeah. -1, -2, -3, -4. Although with religion it's a little bit more difficult because you've got Jesuits coming in, getting everyone to be Catholic again, and then you have a mostly Catholic state with a Jewish minority. But the king, as you say, the king isn't the one who's forcing this. This isn't a, Sigismund II who's decreeing that all this group needs to leave or this other group needs to leave. It's just the people themselves, under the influence of the Jesuits, are adopting Christianity or adopting Catholicism. And then no strong king to do anything about that, to move it one way or another, to force Jews to leave or to, do anything about it. It's just a cultural fact. Here's where it gets kind of interesting in Poland. The king is elected, which is never a good thing if you want to have power. You want to have a hereditary monarchy if you want power. To be elected suggests that every time that somebody new comes along, that the nobles are choosing, they have to tell the nobles, they have to promise the nobles they won't change anything. And so really nothing's going to get changed, which is exactly what the nobles want. And the kings are oftentimes a foreigner. They're not usually ethnic Poles, or not always ethnic Poles, because they're afraid, the nobles are afraid that an ethnic Pole would just know the system better and know the people better and have a better chance of creating a absolutist state. The Diet, or the Parliament, is called the Sejm, and it is a diet of nobles, exclusively nobles, and they have this really interesting, if not tragic, freedom. It's called the Liberum Veto. The Liberum Veto says that in this meeting of several hundred nobles, any one noble can decide at any time to stand up and issue the Liberum Veto. They basically stand up and say, Liberum Veto! What that means is that the Diet is exploded. It means that the people who are there assembled for the Parliament or the Diet have to stop meeting and they have to go home. Now imagine, if you will, if we did that for your classes at school. That in AP Euro, every one of you had the power to explode the class. And so you come in and I'm ready to do my thing, and you're tired, or maybe for some reason somebody has bribed you to end the class. I don't know, maybe it's somebody at home. I don't know. But any one of us could stand up and say, Liberum Veto. And I'd say, sorry class, gotta go. Come back tomorrow, we'll see if we can have class. That sounds great for us, for freedom's sake, right? We don't have to do what we may not want to do. But how are we going to do on the AP test? Yeah, we're not going to do well if our class keeps getting exploded. And this is what happens time and time again. Russia, for example, might decide to go to war with Poland. And all the nobles assemble together in the Diet. And, they're ready to discuss, well, how do we defend ourselves against the Russians? And one particular Polish noble has been bribed by the Russians to explode the Diet. So let's talk about how to defeat Russia. And then suddenly, Liberum Veto. Okay, we've got to go home now.
Couldn't they just counter that?
No, it's an absolute veto. Eventually they're going to try to change it, but it's going to be too late. So this happens a lot. In addition to that one major diet, there are 50 to 60 regional diets where you have a whole bunch of nobles getting together to run their locality. So once again, there is no real strong king. There isn't a number one trying to do number one. It's -1. It's the Parliament running everything. So the king gets elected, he guarantees that he won't change anything, and so there is no number 6. Not even a rudimentary number 6. Not even like before they've had this whole military revolution thing. They don't do it. There is no national army. There are no national law courts. You can imagine that local nobles are the ones who are, the local justices of the peace, if you want to call them that. There is no taxation that's done on a national level with money flowing to the coffers of the king. So who's in charge? It's always local nobles in charge. And once again, that sounds great if you're a local noble. You have all kinds of freedom. Nobody's going to tell you anything. You get to control your serfs without any kind of, without any kind of having to give back at all. You don't have to serve in the military or anything like that. Here's the problem with that. All the other states around are doing something completely different. Maybe part of the reason why Poland is this way is because their noble class is unusually large. About 8% or so of Polish people were part of this noble class. In other places like France, do we have a guesstimate? I'll take 0.5. I'll go anywhere between like 1%, 2% maybe. And now we have 8% as the percentage of nobles. They are, like I say, they're completely controlling their serfs. Their serfs are barely human. And these guys are ruling the country to their or for their advantage. In 1683, this is really, I think, a high point in Polish history. Remember I told you that the Habsburgs are always beating up on the Turks. That happens after 1683. In 1683, it looks like the Turkish army is going to take over Vienna, and then roll over the rest of Western Europe. They are besieging Vienna. And the Poles hear about this, and they don't want the Muslim Turks to roll over the rest of Europe. And so they are able to put together, one time in their history, a credible army under a Polish king, John Sobieski, John III, and he and these other Polish nobles. It's a big place. It could be potentially very powerful. They ride their horses down to Vienna. They surprise the Turks. They send the Turks reeling. The Turks are retreating, and the Poles have rescued Europe from the Turks. And everybody applauds, but then after that, that's sort of it. So the Poles need to enjoy this moment when they saved Europe. The Poles oftentimes think of themselves as a kind of like martyr for Europe. They're always paying for everybody else's sins, and they're kind of like the Christ of Europe. It makes them feel good to suffer. Here's the kicker. Here's the bit where the -5 happens. Poland is sandwiched between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. It's sandwiched between Germans and Russians.
And both of them like to conquer stuff.
And both of them, are kind of violent, and they like to conquer things. And they like to pick on the weaker, and the weaker because of the way that they're set up is Poland. And at this point in time, you have these absolutist states, right? Russia under Peter the Great is becoming an absolute state. Prussia under the Hohenzollerns. And even the Habsburgs are putting together some sort of absolute state, doing number 6 and trying to gain number 5. Well, here's number 5 right here. Poland. Poland gets divided by those 3 states in 3 different partitions, 3 different separations. End of the 18th century. The first time is really kind of unusual. The first time this happens, Russia has beaten up on the Turks, and it is about to take a bunch of territory away from the Turks. And the Prussians and the Austrians say, "Whoa, wait a second! if you take all that territory from the Turks, it upsets the balance of power in Central Europe. You don't take a bunch of territory from the Turks. We'll all take territory from Poland. This has nothing to do at all with the
Now,
war
so
that just
Polish
happened.
beating up on a kid and two other Polish pulling on the side and go, no, let's beat up this kid instead.
Let's take the lunch money of the kid you didn't just beat up.
Yeah.
Because we can. Yeah. Congratulations for beating up that kid. Now we'll steal this other kid's lunch money. It's exactly what happens. So Poland gets divided up between the three at the end of the 18th century. It happens in three partitions. It's gobble, gobble, gobble. It's kind of, you ever seen Pac-Man? Waka, waka, waka. It's just what happens. The Russians are biting off a piece, and the Prussians are biting off a piece, and the Austrians are biting off a piece. The mid-partition is the Austrians are like, hey, we don't need any right now. And the Prussians and Russians, and then all three of them once again at the end. And at the end, it's because the Poles finally say, oh my gosh, I think there's just this little tiny state left. And they say, I think we should maybe get rid of the Liberian veto. And all three of them say, what? You're going to get rid of the Liberian veto? Okay, we're taking the rest of the lunch money. And they're gone. They disappear. Poland disappears from the map in 1795. And it'll be back for just a tiny bit of time under Napoleon. But for the most part, it won't be back until 1919. So poor Poland. It seems to suffer. It seems to get kicked out of it. They needed to have an absolute monarchy. And they did it.